our public witnessing work was just getting started. In the 1920s, we launched a massive preaching campaign around the publication and public talk series, Millions Now Living Will Never Die. We thought outside the box and tried numerous methods to draw the public's attention, and it worked. Over the next several years, we developed even more methods of reaching people.
And will enable you to learn the way of righteousness.
Brothers and sisters even wore their public witnessing in the form of placards, known as sandwich boards, and magazine bags. There were information marches. Imagine being part of one.
And Brother Rutherford, of course, was a shorthand expert, and whenever you talked to him, he'd always be busy writing. He would be making notes, filing them away. So he's doing that this day. He ripped it off and he gave it to me. He said, what do you think of it? And it said, religion's a snare and a racket. So I said, that's pretty strong. As a matter of fact, I said, that's hot. Well, he said, that's what I meant it to be. So now he said, don't you think it'd be a good idea? Now, we're going to have a big information march 2 days from now. Couldn't Brother Clay in the printing make up some signs, religion's a snare and a racket, and put them on poles, and we'll have them for the parade. So, all right, and that's what we did. And Brother Noor was also in London at that time, so he and I led this parade. This parade was 6 miles long. 1,000 brothers showed up for the parade. It really was a spectacle.
In the years that followed, information marches such as these took place across the world. In January of 1940, The Informant announced the beginning of magazine street work, with a focus on working the busiest parts of cities. After that, many became familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses by seeing us offering magazines on streets all over the world. However, not everyone appreciated our efforts. In some cases, entire mobs of people would attack our brothers and sisters. But they courageously pressed forward in the preaching work despite the constant threat of violence.
We've just been watching a segment, Our History in Motion, from the February 2025 JW Broadcasting episode. And I have a lot to say on this. So this is all about public witnessing, and it's making the argument that public witnessing, as done today by Jehovah's Witnesses with their literature carts, really, the history goes all the way back into the 20th century, and some of the placards and slogans and marches that Jehovah's Witnesses participated in. Of course, the problem Jehovah's Witnesses have when they point people towards their history is that they either need to completely misrepresent it to make it more palatable and to cover over the fact that it's a human organization that's been just making things up as it goes along, or they need to mention certain things and just gloss over them in hopes that no one's going to notice. And I think what we've seen in this particular episode is an example of the latter. They did show you what should be some reasons for doubting the Jehovah's Witness claim that they are being used by God. They did show them, they are there. But you actually have to notice them, and you have to think about them, and you have to do research on them. The first one we were given, of course, was the Millions Now Living Will Never Die slogan.
In the 1920s, we launched a massive preaching campaign around the publication and public talk series, Millions Now Living Will Never Die.
Millions now living will never die. That was the slogan. In fact, it was more than a slogan. It was a book. I have it. This is my 1920 copy of Millions Now Living Will Never Die, written by Joseph Rutherford, who then was the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. And it predicted, I mean, you're welcome to find a copy online and read a PDF. Don't take my word for it. It predicted Armageddon to come in 1925. But even if you put that to one side, the 1925 prediction and just focus purely on the words, millions now living will never die. It was published in 1920. So in 1920, they're going around saying, millions now living will never die. I mean, it's self-evident, isn't it, that the overwhelming majority of the people who were receiving that message are now well and truly dead. You know, they have passed on from this mortal coil. You don't really need to do too much research into this, but if you like, I'll show you what ChatGPT says. I asked how many people born before 1921 are still alive. Estimating the number of individuals born before 1921 who are still alive today is challenging due to limited global data. In France, as of July 2024, there were 36 individuals aged between 110 and 114, known as supercentenarians. It goes on, we can estimate there are around 4,300 supercentenarians worldwide. So, quite simply, that was a lie. They were going around publishing what turned out to be a lie. Maybe they didn't know it was a lie at the time. Maybe they had confidence that Armageddon was going to come very soon. Point is, they were wrong. And yet they flashed this thing up on the screen without really giving any context, and certainly without expecting Jehovah's Witnesses to sit down and really think, hang on, did that come true? Did we get that one right? Is this not a little bit embarrassing? So that's one slogan that we saw. Millions now living will never die. It's manifestly a foolish thing to go around saying. Or at the very least, history has proven it to be a foolish thing that they were going around saying. And then we get to religion is a snare and a racket.
He ripped it off and he gave it to me. He said, what do you think of it? And it said, religion's a snare and a racket. So I said, that's pretty strong. As a matter of fact, I said, that's hot. Well, he said, that's what I meant it to be.
So I've been doing a bit of research on this because it's actually quite an interesting facet of Jehovah's Witness history. We heard in the segment earlier Albert Schroeder describing the moment when this slogan was birthed by Joseph Rutherford. Joseph Rutherford scribbles something down on a piece of paper, hands it to Albert Schroeder, and Albert Schroeder says, it's hot. In other words, it's sensational. Well, just because something's hot, just because something's sensational, does that make it advisable to go around saying? Because there was nothing qualifying in the statement. It wasn't saying false religion is a snare and a racket. It was saying religion is a snare and a racket. So anyway, 1938, in London, they start this campaign of walking around with placards saying, religion is a snare and a racket. And we heard there that Noor got involved. Let's just kind of go back. And I want to give you a timeline here, because this is actually very interesting. So 1915 was when Watchtower was exempted from paying real estate taxes on the grounds that they were a religious organization. So from 1915 onwards, they're exempted from paying property taxes. 1934 onwards, Watchtower was exempted from making income tax returns on religious grounds. I'm going to show you where I'm getting this information from very shortly. And then in 1938, they start saying religion is a snare and a racket. You can see the problem here. They are taking all of the rewards of being considered by the government a religious organization while claiming religion is a snare and a racket, which actually, as it happens, I happen to agree with. I happen to agree that religion is a snare and a racket. But isn't it interesting how the religion that's saying that is always the one that's somehow exempt from being a snare and a racket? So in their minds, it doesn't apply to them. It only applies to all other religions. Anyway, 1940, so 2 years on from the march in London, Rutherford releases this book, Religion. And this was basically the book that he decided to write to back up these marches, this slogan that he'd come up with in 1938. I'm going to read to you from page 46 of the book. Religion has long been the chief means of inducing men to yield to the influence of other men. The religious person fears the pastor, clergyman, or leader of his religious system, and hence he yields to the instruction of such men. And in this way, the demons entrap the unsuspecting ones. A person fears that he will not receive the approval of men, particularly the religious leaders, and thus he is led into the snare of the enemy. And then later on, he writes, Christianity and religion are two separate and distinct things, and the two are in complete opposition to each other. Those who practice religion are numerous, those who truly are Christians are few. It will be found that the religionists are under the influence and power of the demons, whether they know it or not. So he draws a distinction between religion and Christianity. He says one's bad, religion, and one's good, Christianity. He coins a term, religionists, to dehumanize or to pour scorn on those who consider themselves part of religion. And he invokes talk of demons being involved. You know, apart from talking about the demons, I kind of agree with much of what Rutherford said there. I do think religion has been formulated as a means of controlling people. I think that's kind of obvious. But again, we have this problem that Joseph Franklin Rutherford is writing as the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which has, for decades up to that point, been benefiting from tax exemptions on the basis of being a religion. You can't have it both ways. He is essentially making himself a hypocrite by saying all this. Then we go on to 1941, and again I'm going to show you the source for this. But in 1941, a judge ruled that Jehovah's Witnesses are a religion in a case of local interference with Jehovah's Witnesses who were preaching in Texas. So there was some persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses who were preaching in Texas, and a judge ruled that Jehovah's Witnesses are a legitimate religion. So this is the year after Rutherford has published his religion book. 1942, a general cleared a Jehovah's Witness from selective service on grounds that he was a minister of religion. 1945 was when this book was published. Its title, Theocratic Aid to Kingdom Publishers. A very interesting book. I guess the modern version of it would be Organized to Do Jehovah's Will. This was like an early version of that, really. It basically codified what it meant to be a Jehovah's Witness and what Jehovah's Witnesses were supposed to do and how they were supposed to be organized and what their basic teachings should be. And on page 284, again, 1945, it said, "Religion is the doing of anything that is contrary to Jehovah's will." Doubtless that definition will sound very strange to ears attuned to religious Christendom's ways. Notwithstanding, the lessons in this section pile up powerful evidence against religion by reviewing its history. Its history is one of bloodshed and oppression, of divisions and strives within itself, and of venomous hatred and persecution of Jehovah's true servants. Moreover, its departure from and opposition toward God's word, the Bible, is clearly revealed in the indisputable facts unveiled. But in the end, Jehovah God will be fully vindicated over religion, and in that glorious work of righteousness, zealous and trained kingdom publishers on earth will share. So really the organization is talking out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, publicly and in courts of law, and when it comes to dealing with the IRS, they are saying, we're a religion. And then in its publications, repeatedly and very emphatically, they are denouncing religion as entirely at odds with Christianity, as something that people should be distancing themselves from. So it's hypocrisy. It's giving two completely different messages. You can't say religion is a snare and a racket when you yourself are identifying yourself as a religion because it benefits you monetarily and in other ways. And then finally, it seems, in 1950, so 12 years after Rutherford scribbled down those words on the piece of paper and handed it to Schroeder, 12 years on, the penny finally drops, and this book is written, Defending and Legally Establishing the Good News. The author isn't cited, but I'm almost 100% sure this was written by Hayden Covington, who was the lead counsel for Jehovah's Witnesses. He actually did, if I'm just going to be completely objective, he actually did a great deal of very positive work in establishing legal precedents for religious freedoms in the United States. So here is a man who, even though his motives may have been slightly out of whack, he did some actually quite important legal work for religious freedoms. And he wrote this book explaining how Jehovah's Witnesses should defend themselves in a variety of different situations where they might end up having to be in front of a judge for whatever reason. And this book makes it abundantly clear that Jehovah's Witnesses are a religion. So on page 72, it says, Jehovah's Witnesses are recognized as ministers constituting a legal religious organization, and the Watchtower Society, because of its religious status, has been found by the state and federal governments of the United States to be exempt from the payment of taxes. And then the writer, assumedly Hayden Covington, goes on to list a number of lawsuits and legal decisions, including those dates that I mentioned earlier, 1915, tax exemption, etc., etc. He goes on to list all of these instances in which the federal government or a judge or a general has made an affirmative statement that Jehovah's Witnesses are a religion. And that section dealing with the religiosity, I guess you could say, of Jehovah's Witnesses ends with the statement, it is submitted that the Watchtower Society and Jehovah's Witnesses are a legal religious organization and that their representatives engaged in preaching the gospel are legally recognized as ministers of religion, which entitles them to all privileges accorded to all religious organizations and ministers. This book, I don't think was for everybody to read. I could be wrong, but I would imagine that this book was more for specific situations where they needed to hire maybe an outside lawyer, or where a particular elder or someone in charge got into trouble, they would send out this book. I don't think it was for general circulation among the masses. Nevertheless, it's clearly at odds with publications that were being distributed even at that time that had started circulation only a few years prior. That was 1950. Then in 1951, towards the end of 1951, I might add, we get the November 1st issue of the 1951 Watchtower, which completely reverses the language against religion and basically says, you know what, we accept it. We are a religion. So from 1938, they start saying we're not a religion. And then finally in 1951, they flip-flop back and say we are a religion. I'll read you a few quotes, and you can find this on the Watchtower Online Library. It's actually page 659, again, the November 1st, 1951 Watchtower. The reproach now falling on the religion of both Christendom and heathendom is therefore not without cause, it is deserved. It was with this religion in mind that the slogan was first raised in London, England in 1938. Religion is a snare and a racket. Serve God and Christ the King. And then in the following paragraph, it says, because the people in general fail to make a distinction between the false and the true, and because worldly religion has made an odious name for itself, there has been a tendency in recent years to avoid using the name religion in connection with the truth and the organization of Jehovah God. I'm just going to pause there. What they're saying is we've avoided using it in public, but we've very much been using it privately in front of judges and in front of the federal government. Anyway. But apostate Christendom has brought great reproach upon the name Christianity, to which she claims the exclusive right. If we were to avoid a name just because of the shame and vituperation which Christendom has unjustly brought upon it, then we might as well avoid the name Christianity and refuse to be called Christians. So they're now saying, well, if we're just going to abandon a word because of what other people have done to it, we should abandon the word Christians too, because people have given Christianity a bad name. And then later on, it says, if you live up to the name Christian in spite of the suffering it brings, you can glorify God in this name. In the same way, a distinction needs to be made between the false religion and the true religion. So just like that, they drop their anti-religion stance. It's a flip-flop. And again, I think it's very disingenuous for the organization to just flash this slogan upon its screen or to make very, very brief mention of it without giving us this context. Because when you actually explore the context, when you drill down deeper, what you see in just these few words, religion is a snare and a racket, is a very obvious example of total hypocrisy.